What if Jesus left behind one final teaching, not for the multitudes and not for the institutions that later spoke in his name, but for a small circle of initiates, prepared to hear what was never meant for the surface of religion? A secret so unsettling, so powerful, that the early church let it fall into shadow and buried it for nearly 2,000 years. Because hidden within the Gospel of Philip lies what many believe is the last layer of Jesus' inner teaching, a forgotten mystery that does not offer outer comfort, but a way to see through the illusion of this world and return to the wholeness humanity once knew and lost. At the center of that lost truth is a phrase that has been misunderstood for centuries: the bridal chamber. Most people hear it and imagine earthly marriage, a ritual of bodies, a sacred union in the ordinary sense. But that is not what Philip is pointing to. The bridal chamber names something far deeper and more unsettling: the reunion of the divided self, the restoration of the bond between your human consciousness and the divine spark within you, the return to a unity that was fractured the moment the soul entered this world. Jesus spoke openly in parables, but he reserved certain mysteries for those ready to receive them. And according to Philip, this mystery stood above all others, not as a symbol of social union, but as the highest sacrament, the hidden threshold where what was broken could become whole again. If that is true, then what has been forgotten is not just a teaching, but a key. And once you begin to sense what the bridal chamber really means, you begin to see why it mattered so deeply and why its return changes everything. There are moments in a human life when what feels missing is not something you failed to achieve, but something you were taught to forget. And if that is true, then the most dangerous teaching is not the one that tells you what to believe, but the one that quietly reminds you of what was taken from your sight long ago. There are moments in a human life when what feels missing is not something you failed to achieve, but something you were taught to forget. And if that is true, then the most dangerous teaching is not the one that tells you what to believe, but the one that quietly reminds you of what was taken from your sight long ago. That is the atmosphere surrounding the bridal chamber in the Gospel of Philip. It moved in whispers, in fragments, in guarded language, as if it belonged not to the surface of religion, but to an inner room hidden behind it. And that raises a question many people feel before they can even put it into words. Why were you never taught this? Why did so many inherit a version of Jesus centered almost entirely on external salvation, while so little was said about inner transformation, about the healing of division within the self, about a return to a light that may have been with you before the world ever gave you a name? If the bridal chamber was described by Philip as the highest sacrament, why does it feel absent from the polished story so many have heard? One possible answer is unsettling in the deepest way. Once a person begins to remember what this world trained them to forget, they no longer move through life in the same obedient sleep. They stop living only by the role given to them. They begin to sense the machinery of illusion around them, the subtle architecture of fear, dependence, identity, and repetition. They begin to notice that much of what shaped them came from outside, but something older, quieter, and more intimate has been waiting underneath it all. In that sense, the bridal chamber is not merely an idea from a forgotten text. It becomes a threshold, a way of seeing, a recovery of something long estranged within. To understand why such a teaching could feel forbidden, you have to step back into the world Jesus actually lived in, not the flattened world of later certainty, but a landscape alive with spiritual tension, debate, longing, risk, revelation, and experiment. The earliest followers of Jesus were not yet arranged into one stable system. They were joined less by dogma than by hunger, by the sense that beneath the parables, beneath the public sayings, there was something more, something that could not be handed to everyone in the same form. Some teachings were spoken openly, others appear to have been entrusted privately. Names like Philip, Thomas, and Mary Magdalene carry that atmosphere in the texts associated with them, as though they were preserving not a different Jesus, but different layers of access to what he was trying to awaken in those around him. By the 1st and 2nd centuries, many Christian movements existed at once: mystical, philosophical, ascetic, visionary, revolutionary, and among them were those later called the Gnostics, a label often used by their opponents, yet one that now points toward a family of teachings centered on inner awakening. What made these movements so difficult for rising institutional religion was not simply that they were unusual, it was that they shifted the center of gravity. Where more orthodox forms increasingly emphasize structure, authority, obedience, hierarchy, and visible ritual, the Gnostic streams preserve something harder to control: the suggestion that the divine is already within the human being, that salvation is not merely granted from the outside, but remembered through awakening, and that Jesus came not only to rescue people from sin in a moral or legal sense, but to awaken them from illusion, forgetfulness, and spiritual amnesia. That idea changes everything, because if the deepest meeting with God happens within the soul, then no institution can fully monopolize the path. The Gospel of Philip emerges from precisely that atmosphere. It does not read like a biography, and it does not try to retell the public story in a neat sequence. It feels more like a manual scattered into luminous pieces, a collection of sayings, symbols, sacramental hints, paradoxes, and riddles meant for those who already know the outer narrative and are being invited beneath it. Philip seems to assume that the reader already knows the outer story. What he offers instead are keys, interior meanings, hidden correspondences, traces of a teaching that seems to belong to the private side of the tradition. At the center of that interior teaching stands the bridal chamber. Mainstream Christianity often came to speak most clearly of 3 sacraments: baptism, chrism, and the Eucharist. Philip, however, lists 5 and places the bridal chamber above the others, as though it were not one more rite among rites, but the culmination of the path itself, the point at which what has been divided is restored to wholeness. This alone helps explain the secrecy surrounding it. If the bridal chamber is not about outer marriage or visible ritual, then what is it? Why is it treated as the highest mystery? Why does Philip speak of it with such gravity and yet refuse to reduce it to plain explanation? The reason is that what is at stake here is not merely a belief, it is a shift in where the sacred is located. If the reconciliation Jesus taught happens within, then mediation changes, power changes, dependence changes. The person who discovers the divine presence within cannot be controlled in quite the same way as the person who believes all access must come from elsewhere. This may help explain why such teachings were softened, pushed to the margins, or allowed to fade. They gave too much dignity to the interior life, and they suggested that beneath ordinary brokenness, something whole still remained. And that brings us to the next and perhaps most personal question of all. If the bridal chamber is the healing of a division within you, then what exactly was divided in the first place? And how did that fracture become so normal that most people now live inside it without even knowing it? If that fracture has followed you longer than memory, then the ache you carry may not have begun with any single event in this life, but with a deeper separation that entered your awareness the moment you descended into the density of this world. This is the next layer the Gospel of Philip begins to hint at, and it is where the bridal chamber stops feeling like an abstract religious symbol and becomes intensely personal. According to the inner teaching preserved around Jesus, the deepest wound in a human being does not begin in childhood alone, and it does not end with ordinary explanations of pain. It begins when the soul passes from a higher order of being into the realm of matter, what Jesus called the kingdom in one register and what Philip's tradition later names the pleroma in another. Between those two conditions lies a descent, not merely through space, but through layers of forgetfulness. Ancient Gnostic language describes these layers as archonic spheres, veils, currents, powers, structures of density through which consciousness passes as it enters embodiment. And with every level of descent, something is obscured. The soul begins to forget. It forgets where it came from. It forgets why it came. It forgets the living bond between its earthly awareness and the aspect of itself that never left the light. That forgetting is not presented as a small loss. It is described as a split, a fracture in consciousness, the dividing of what was once whole into two distinct modes of being. One part becomes identified with the world, with personality, with reaction, with fear, with time. The other remains linked to the higher image, the heavenly counterpart, the hidden source. Different traditions gave this mystery different names: the heavenly twin and the earthly self, spirit and soul, higher image and lower reflection, angel and human counterpart. Jesus pointed to it in symbolic language when he spoke of the two becoming one. Philip goes further, as though trying to preserve the shocking implication of that saying. What was lost was not only memory. What was lost was access to an aspect of your own being. The bridal chamber, then, is not a reward added onto life from outside. It is the mystery of reunion, the healing of that original division. This is why Philip can preserve the line, "When you make the two one, then you will say to the mountain, 'Move,' and it will move," not merely as poetry, but as a statement about restored power. Not the power of domination, but the power that returns when consciousness is no longer at war with itself. Because when a person is inwardly divided, everything leaks away. Strength leaks away. Clarity leaks away. Presence leaks away. Intuition becomes faint. Action becomes conflicted. Desire fragments into endless substitutes. And much of what modern life calls success becomes, for many people, an elaborate attempt to fill a quiet absence they cannot even name. Achievement, approval, relationships, busyness, distraction, control, all of it can become a way of circling around a loss that cannot be repaired from the outside because it was born on the inside. This is where the language of illusion becomes so important in these teachings. Jesus, in the way Philip's tradition remembers him, is not simply warning about error in an intellectual sense. He is pointing toward a world that feeds on fragmentation. A divided person is easier to guide by fear, easier to seduce by image, easier to distract with noise, easier to keep asleep with repetition and longing. But the moment remembrance begins, something shifts. The moment the separated parts of the self begin turning toward one another, the illusion loses some of its hold. What once felt absolute begins to look theatrical. What once felt final begins to reveal seams. Philip adds another layer that can sound strange at first, until you feel what it is pointing toward. He suggests that a person who remains spiritually alone, inwardly ununified, can become vulnerable to lower influences, what he calls unclean spirits or wandering energies. Whether taken literally or symbolically, the meaning is clear. Fragmentation weakens sovereignty. But those who have reunited with their angel, their inner counterpart, the more luminous dimension of themselves, are no longer so easily dominated. This is not fear-based teaching. It is a language of dignity. It is about reclaiming interior authority. It is about becoming less governable by what is external, because something central has come alive within. That is why Philip calls the bridal chamber the Holy of Holies, not as a place built by hands, but as an inner sanctuary where the seeker becomes whole enough that the world can no longer shape them in the old way. And this union is not romantic, not bodily, not about earthly marriage, despite the imagery. It points to the meeting of two realities inside a single life: your inner masculine and feminine, your will and your wisdom, your clarity and your compassion, your human awareness and your divine spark. In a fractured world, these poles drift apart. Action separates from insight. Feeling separates from truth. Strength hardens without tenderness. Receptivity weakens without discernment. And the person begins to feel split even in ordinary moments, wanting one thing while living another, sensing something deeper but being unable to remain there. The bridal chamber is the moment those poles draw back into relation. Think of it like a candle and a flame. The candle gives form, shape, containment. The flame gives light, heat, animation. Without the flame, the candle remains intact but dark. Without the candle, the flame has no stable place to dwell. Your earthly self is the vessel. Your higher self is the living fire. When they meet, something changes in the quality of your presence. Perception becomes more lucid. Meaning begins to gather around events differently. Synchronicities appear, not as magic tricks, but as signs that your inner world is no longer sealed off from a deeper order. Even the feeling of isolation begins to soften, because you are no longer living as though you are only the surface self. This, in Philip's mystical frame, is the real meaning of rebirth. Not simply adopting a belief, not undergoing an outer rite alone, but rejoining the light that was forgotten when consciousness entered division. And if that sounds hidden, it is because it was hidden, not only by institutions, but by the nature of the thing itself. For some truths cannot be handed to a person as information. They must be recognized from within, which leads to the next mystery. If the bridal chamber is the healing of the split and the reunion of the human with the divine, what actually takes place in that inner chamber? And why did Philip preserve it through symbols instead of explaining it plainly? If Philip guarded this mystery in symbols, it may be because the bridal chamber is not something a person can fully understand from the outside, only something they begin to recognize when a forgotten part of them stirs and answers from within. That is why the Gospel of Philip never describes the bridal chamber in plain, literal terms. It does not read like confusion. It reads like protection, as though the teaching itself refuses to be reduced into language that the surface mind can collect and control. In this tradition, Jesus is remembered as saying that some mysteries are given directly, while others can only be approached through parables. Because a higher state of consciousness cannot simply be transferred like information. It has to awaken. Philip echoes this when he says that the mysteries of truth are revealed only to those who can receive them in the Spirit. In other words, the bridal chamber is not hidden because it is empty, but because it belongs to a level of experience that words can only point toward. Even so, Philip leaves behind luminous clues. One of the most striking is the teaching that the soul cannot receive the bridegroom unless she becomes pure light. Read in a literal or moralistic way, that sentence becomes narrow and distorted. Read inwardly, it opens. The bridegroom is not merely an external figure. He represents the higher self, the divine presence, the living image through which human consciousness is rejoined to its source. The soul, in this symbolic language, is your earthly awareness, the mind and heart moving through the world of reaction, memory, identity, fear, and desire. Purity here is not about social innocence or moral performance. It is about clarity. It is the condition of seeing without distortion, of meeting yourself without the masks the world has taught you to wear. Philip's point is subtle but piercing. Union with the divine counterpart becomes possible only when you begin to perceive yourself truthfully, beneath your roles, beneath your defenses, beneath the borrowed identities that keep you estranged from your own light. This is why Jesus could say the kingdom is within, and yet so few perceive it. The problem was never distance, it was forgetfulness. The bridal chamber clears that inner fog. Philip deepens the teaching even further with the saying that if you make the two one, you will become a son of man. To the ancient Gnostics, this was not a decorative phrase. It pointed to a real transformation in the structure of consciousness. When the inner masculine and feminine are no longer divided, when your earthly self is no longer cut off from your higher image, you stop living only in reaction to the world and begin to live from a deeper creative center. This is one way to understand the strange promise that those awakened to the same light could do greater things, not because they replaced Jesus, but because the same divine presence he embodied is also hidden in them, waiting not to be brought from elsewhere, but remembered. This is why the bridal chamber stood as the crown of the mysteries. Baptism could be understood as washing away ignorance. Chrism could be understood as anointing memory awake. The Eucharist could symbolize receiving divine life. But the bridal chamber pointed towards something even more intimate. The moment when divine reality ceased to be merely received as symbol and became lived as direct inner union. Philip offers another image that gathers the whole teaching into a single line. No one can see themselves in water or in a mirror without light. That is as close to a summary of this path as one could ask for. You cannot see your true self without the light already present within you. The answer you seek cannot be found only by adding more beliefs, more validation, more external certainty. The turning point comes when you stop searching outward for the missing center and turn inward toward the one presence that has never entirely abandoned you. And here, the deeper implication of the teaching becomes clear. A person who becomes whole is no longer easily ruled by fear, no longer easily manipulated by shame, no longer easily controlled by the demand to seek outside what can only be confirmed within. The divided self remains dependent. The integrated self becomes difficult to dominate because such a person no longer walks through life as a fragment begging the world to define them. They begin to move as a presence. That is why the bridal chamber is not a ritual of two bodies, but the marriage of two worlds, the human that walks and the divine that quietly guides. And its power is not reserved for some distant past. It appears in the smallest moments of your life. Philip makes clear that this chamber is entered through awareness, not ceremony. It begins in something disarmingly simple, pausing. Jesus often withdrew into silence, not because silence itself was the goal, but because without silence, the deeper voice remains unheard. The Gnostic understanding preserved that insight. Most people live in a kind of half-dream, reacting before seeing, seeking before listening, surviving without remembering who is doing the living. Awakening begins when that pattern is interrupted by a question sincere enough to open a crack in the surface. Who is watching my thoughts? Who is here beneath the reaction? Who is aware of this fear, this anger, this longing, this performance? These are not questions meant to be solved quickly. They are lamps carried into inner darkness. Each time you return to them, some part of the fog thins. The bridal chamber opens precisely there, when you stop chasing your reflection in the world and begin meeting the one within who has been watching the world all along. The next time emotion surges through you, when you feel wounded, defensive, restless, or desperate for validation, there is another way to meet the moment. Pause. Notice the sensation. Then ask not why this is happening, but who inside you is experiencing it. That shift changes everything. It interrupts the old spell. It opens a space where the deeper self, the inner bridegroom, the calm and unshaken presence within, can begin to enter the conversation. This is not suppression, and it is not self-improvement in the ordinary sense. It is remembrance in real time. It is the reenactment of the bridal chamber within consciousness itself, where the human and the divine, the earthly and the heavenly, the wounded and the luminous begin to face one another again. Over time, that changes the texture of your life. Decisions grow cleaner, intuition sharpens, inner conflict softens, fear loosens its grip. The world may remain chaotic, but it no longer reaches you in the same broken way because you are not meeting it as a divided being. The quiet longing you carried for so long, that sense that something essential was missing, begins to dissolve, not because you finally found a new truth somewhere outside yourself, but because you remembered what was never entirely lost. In that light, the Gospel of Philip becomes more than a strange ancient text. It becomes a mirror. It reveals where you are split, where you have mistaken survival for identity, where you have forgotten the companion hidden within your own depths. The bridal chamber was never meant to be a distant curiosity or a relic of religious history. It points to an inner threshold, the moment your human self and your divine self begin to recognize one another again. And when that recognition begins, however quietly, however imperfectly, the illusion starts to weaken and the old structure starts to crack. And yet the deepest changes rarely arrive with noise. They begin quietly, almost beneath notice, as if another center of gravity has started to form within you. That is why what you have just moved through may feel less like information and more like recognition. And perhaps that is enough for now. Not another answer to chase, not another layer to force open, but simply the quiet recognition that something in you has been listening all along. What you have moved through here is not meaningless, and the feelings it stirred are not random. The tension, the longing, the strange sense of remembrance, the moments of resistance, the moments of clarity, all of it belongs to the path you are already walking, even if you have not always had words for it. Nothing in this inner movement suggests that you are late or lost or somehow forgotten. It may be that what feels unfinished is simply still unfolding in its own season, and what feels hidden has not been absent, only waiting until it could be felt in a different way. The language of these teachings can sound ancient, but what they point to is intimate. The return of something within you that has remained quietly present beneath the noise, beneath the fear, beneath every version of yourself that had to be shaped by the world. If this journey has seemed to uncover a division, it has also revealed the possibility of gentleness toward that division, as though even your searching has been part of a deeper remembering. There is no need here to arrive all at once. There is only the softening of what was once tight, the easing of what was once strained, and the growing sense that you are not separate from the light you have been seeking. In that way, the bridal chamber no longer feels distant or hidden in history alone, but closer, quieter, more inward than it first appeared. And if something in these forgotten teachings has felt familiar, then what follows may feel less like moving on and more like continuing a conversation that was already waiting for you. For me, what makes this teaching so powerful is not that it demands belief, but that it creates a strange and intimate feeling of recognition, as if it is describing something many people have carried in silence for years without ever finding the language for it. The idea of the bridal chamber, the divided self, the hidden light, all of it, can be heard as ancient symbolism, but it can also feel deeply personal, like a mirror held up to the parts of us that have been tired, fragmented, searching, and quietly hoping there is more to life than the surface we were taught to accept. And maybe that is why teachings like this continue to return. Not to force an answer, but to awaken a question that feels impossible to ignore once it has entered the heart. I would really love to know how this landed with you. Did this feel like a forgotten spiritual idea, a powerful inner symbol, or something that touched your own life in a more direct way? When you hear the phrase "make the two one," what does it awaken in you? If you feel called to share, leave a comment below with the words "I am remembering," or simply describe the part of this message that stayed with you most. If this video resonated with you, a quiet like or subscription helps this kind of hidden wisdom find others who may be searching for it without even knowing. And truly, thank you for being here, for watching all the way through, and for supporting this space where these quiet, forgotten teachings can still be explored together.